My mother confessed she had been sexually abused by her father, my grandfather, and she had a child from that abuse. That child is me. I'm my own grandfather's child. Imagine this. You're in your 30s. You have a normal life, a job, maybe a family of your own. You think you know your family story, and then your mother sits you down. She's crying. She's been holding this in for decades. She says, I need to tell you something about your origins, about why you exist. You think maybe she's going to talk about your father. Maybe she's going to say he wasn't who you thought. You're not prepared for what comes next. She says, my father, your grandfather, he sexually abused me. For years, starting when I was a child. Your stomach drops, she says, and I became pregnant. From that abuse, I was a teenager. I didn't know what to do. I didn't tell anyone for years. You're listening, but you're not comprehending. She says, that pregnancy, that baby, that was you. You are the biological product of your grandfather's sexual abuse of your mother. You are your own grandfather's child. Your mother is both your mother and a victim of severe sexual abuse by her father. This is a story about discovering that your existence is rooted in generational trauma, about understanding family dysfunction, on a level most people never have to contemplate, about processing the knowledge that you are literally the result of incest and child sexual abuse. Okay, before I read this full story, I need to be clear about what we're discussing. This is from our True Off My Chest and our family trauma. And I want to give you a content warning right now. This story deals with child sexual abuse graphic discussion, incest, generational, trauma processing, family dysfunction, psychological impact of abuse. This is not sensationalized. This is not exploitation. This is someone processing real generational trauma in their family. This story covers a child discovering the truth about their origins, understanding their mother as a victim, processing shame, guilt, and identity, generational patterns of dysfunction, how families hide abuse, the psychological impact on the abuse survivor's child, understanding why mothers don't report abuse, breaking generational cycles, healing and understanding. What's important to understand is that this person is not responsible for their origins. They didn't choose to exist this way, but they have to process the reality that they do. By the end, you're going to understand why some families keep secrets this big, and why discovering them causes such profound trauma. This is heavy material, but it's real. And it deserves to be heard, and let's get into it. I'm 34 years old now. Growing up, I knew something was wrong with my family, but I couldn't articulate what. My grandfather was always a distant figure. He lived nearby, but wasn't very involved in my life. My mother would see him occasionally, but there was always this tension, this discomfort. I remember my mother being anxious around him. I remember her making excuses not to visit. I remember her voice changing when he called. But I was a kid. I didn't understand what that meant. My mother never talked about her childhood. If I asked, she'd deflect. She'd say it was normal, nothing special. But there were cracks in that narrative. She had very limited contact with her extended family. She didn't talk about her siblings much. She seemed isolated from her own family of origin. She was also very protective of me. Hyperprotective in some ways. She didn't like me spending time alone with male relatives. She was anxious about my safety in ways that seemed excessive. Looking back, these were all signs. Signs that something had happened. Signs that she was carrying trauma. But nobody talked about it. Nobody named it. My mother married my father when she was young. 19. I was born when she was 20. My father left when I was 5. I barely remember him. My mother raised me alone. She was a good mother overall. She was loving and supportive. She worked hard to provide for me. But she was also anxious. She was also guarded. She was also distant in certain ways. She never had another serious relationship. She never dated. It was just me and her. I thought that was just who she was. I thought she was just a private person. But now I understand. She was a trauma survivor. She was protecting herself. This is how abuse often manifests in families. Not through dramatic explosions, but through patterns, through silences, through overprotectiveness, through withdrawal. The person being abused carries it silently, and the children notice the effects without understanding the cause. When I was a teenager, my mother had a breakdown. Nothing dramatic, but I remember her crying in her room. I remember her being depressed for several months. I asked her if something was wrong. She said she was just tired. But she wasn't just tired. She was dealing with decades of trauma. She went to therapy at one point. She didn't tell me what they discussed, but I noticed she was slightly better after. Less anxious, more present, painful. Processing trauma means reliving it. Many survivors avoid that pain. As a young adult, I moved out. I built my own life. I had my own relationships. I had my own career. But I was always aware that my mother was dealing with something, that there was this unspoken weight she carried. I just didn't know what it was. When you're a child and you sense that a parent is traumatized, but they never tell you why, how does that affect you? How does that shape who you become? I got a call from my mother one afternoon. She said she needed to see me. She said it was important. I drove to her house. She was sitting on the porch waiting for me. She looked older than usual, tired. We sat down at the kitchen table. She poured coffee. Her hands were shaking slightly. She said, "I need to tell you something. Something I've been keeping from you your entire life." I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew it was serious. She said, "This is going to be hard to hear, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but you deserve to know the truth." I said, "Okay, tell me." She took a breath, a very long breath. She said, "Your grandfather, my father, he sexually abused me, starting when I was 9 years old. It continued for several years. I couldn't process what I was hearing. My brain was trying to make sense of words that didn't make sense together." I said, "What?" She said it again. "My father sexually abused me. For years, starting in childhood. I felt like I couldn't breathe." I said, Did you tell anyone?" She said, "No, I was ashamed. I was scared. I was a child and I didn't have the language to name what was happening." She said, "I buried it. I didn't think about it. I tried to pretend it never happened." I said, "But it did happen." She said, "Yes, it did." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. I said, "Why are you telling me this now?" She said, "Because there's more. And you need to know." She said, "When I was 15, I became pregnant. I was confused and traumatized, and I didn't understand what had happened to me. I didn't have anyone to talk to. I felt something shift in my understanding." She said, "I carried that pregnancy secretly. I didn't tell anyone, not my mother, not my siblings, not my father." She said, "I was going to have an abortion, but I was scared, and I waited too long and it became too complicated." She said, "So I had the baby." I said, "What happened to the baby?" She said, "I gave him up for adoption." She said, "That was my only option at the time. I couldn't raise a child. I was a child myself." She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "But before I gave him up, I held him." I looked at his face. I saw my father's face in his features. She said, "And I knew. I knew that the baby was my father's child, that I had carried my father's child." I said, "Wait, the baby was your father's?" She said, "Yes." She said, "I gave him up for adoption to a family that could take care of him, and I never told anyone what had happened." She said, "I buried it so deep that sometimes I could almost pretend it didn't happen." She said, "But it did happen. And that baby, that child I gave up." She looked at me directly in the eyes. She said, "That was your biological brother." I said, "So, I have a brother?" She said, "Yes, a half-brother, from when I was 15. I said, "And the father is..." She said, "Your grandfather, my father." The room started spinning. I said, "So that means..." I couldn't finish the sentence. She said it for me. "That means your grandfather is also your biological great-grandfather. The man who abused me is connected to you through multiple layers of family connection." I said, "But what about me? How am I..." She said, "After I gave up my son for adoption, I spent years being broken. I was in pain. I was traumatized. I was dealing with what had happened to me and what I'd done." She said, "And then when I was 17, I became pregnant again." I felt my world tilt. I said, "Who was the father?" She said, "It was my father." "It happened again." She said, "This time I didn't hide it." I couldn't hide it. I was showing. I had to tell someone. She said, "I told my mother." She was horrified. She kicked me out of the house. She said, "I gave birth to you when I was 18, and I raised you as a single mother." Everything became clear and horrifying at once. I said, "So you're telling me I'm the result of your father sexually abusing you?" She said, "Yes." I said, "My grandfather is my biological father." She said, "Yes." I said, "And I have a brother from when you were raped before that." She said, "Yes." I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. At the moment of that revelation, what would you have felt? Understanding that your very existence is rooted in your mother's abuse? I don't remember how long I sat there. Time felt weird, distorted. My mother was waiting for me to say something. I said, Why didn't you ever tell me?" She said, "Because I was ashamed. Because I didn't know how to explain it. Because I wanted to protect you from knowing that you came from violence." She said, "You're not responsible for how you came into the world. You're not responsible for your grandfather's actions. I didn't want you to carry that burden." I said, "But I'm carrying it now." She said, "I know. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I said, does my grandfather, does he know? She said, I don't think he understood what he did. I think he was so disconnected from reality that he didn't process it as abuse. But yes, he knew he fathered you. I said, and he just left you to raise me alone? She said he didn't acknowledge it. It was like it didn't exist to him. He went on with his life. I said, he's still alive? She said, yes, he's in his 90s now. He's in a care facility. I said, has he ever been prosecuted? She said, no, I never reported him. I was too afraid, too ashamed, too broken to pursue it. I felt something in me shift, something between anger and numbness. She said, I've spent decades in therapy trying to process this, trying to understand how to raise a child born from that trauma, without passing the trauma to you. She said, I tried my best. I hope I succeeded. I said, why are you telling me now? She said, because you're an adult. Because you deserve to know the truth about where you come from. Because I found my biological son. I said, what? She said, the baby I gave up for adoption, your half-brother, I found him. Through DNA testing and adoption registries. He's 54 years old now. He has his own family. She said, he knew he was adopted. And he wanted to find his biological mother. And so we connected. She said, talking to him, reconnecting with him. It triggered everything. All the memories I'd buried. She said, and I realized I couldn't keep this secret from you anymore. I said, does he know? Does my brother know that your father is his father? She said, yes, I told him. I said, and how did he react? She said, the same way you are right now. With shock, with pain, with confusion. She said, but also with understanding. He got it. He understood that none of this was my fault. She said, and neither is any of this your fault. This is a key moment. The mother is trying to absolve her child of responsibility for something he has no control over, his origins. But the child is processing something much larger. Understanding that he exists because of generational trauma. I left her house and I drove around for hours. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. I went to a park and I sat on a bench and I cried. I cried for my mother. I cried for myself. I cried for the brother I never knew. And I cried for my grandfather, who clearly was also a victim of something, whatever dysfunction or trauma, created a man capable of abusing his own child. Not excusing him, but understanding that trauma is generational. It passes down. It compounds. How would you process discovering that your very existence is rooted in abuse? How would you separate yourself from that origin story? Over the next few weeks, I had to reconcile several impossible things. First, understanding my mother as a victim, not just as my mother, but as a person who experienced severe, prolonged sexual abuse as a child. I had to sit with the knowledge that the person who raised me, who loved me, who did the best she could for me, she was a survivor of incest and sexual assault. That changed how I understood her. Her anxiety, her protectiveness, her isolation. All of it made sense now. Second, understanding my grandfather as a perpetrator. A man I barely knew who I had minimal relationship with was a predator, not in some abstract way, in a specific direct way. He abused my mother. He fathered children with her. For most of my life, I thought he was just a distant old man. Now I understood he was a monster. But third, and this is where it gets complicated, understanding that I couldn't hate him without hating myself. Because I carry his DNA. I am literally his biological grandchild and great-grandchild. Some of his genetic material is in me. That's a horrifying thought. That some of the person who committed these acts is literally woven into my biological structure. I started having intrusive thoughts. Thoughts about whether I inherited predatory tendencies. Whether there was something in me that could make me capable of harming others. These are irrational thoughts. I know that. Genetics doesn't determine behavior. Trauma doesn't have to repeat, but they're understandable thoughts for someone in my situation. This is a common response to discovering that you're related to someone who committed terrible acts. The shame and fear that you might inherit not just genetics, but behavior. I reached out to my mother and told her these thoughts. She said, you're not your grandfather. You're not his behavior. You're not his crimes. She said, you're someone who knows this history. Someone who can choose to do better. Someone who can break the cycle. She said, the fact that you're afraid of becoming like him means you won't. People capable of abuse don't fear becoming abusers. That helped, but it didn't erase the thought completely. I also had to process my relationship with my brother, my half-brother, a man I'd never met, a man who is also the product of my grandfather's abuse. We reached out to each other through my mother. We exchanged emails. He wrote, I understand this is strange. You and I are half-siblings born from the same abuser. We never knew each other, but we're connected in ways that most siblings aren't. We met in person a few months later. It was one of the strangest and most powerful experiences of my life. We looked at each other and we could see the family resemblance. We could see our grandfather's features in each other. He said, "It's weird, right? Looking at your face and seeing the person who abused us both." I said, "Yeah." He said, "But I don't blame you for it. Just like I don't blame your mother, we're all victims of the same person." He said, "I was angry when I first found out how I came to be, but I'm also grateful to be alive. And I'm grateful to have a sister, a half-sister, who shares this experience." We talked for hours. We talked about our lives, our families, our processing of the trauma. It was healing in its own way. If you discovered you had a half-sibling born from the same abuse, how would you process that connection? After the initial shock, I started to research generational trauma. I wanted to understand how this happens, how abuse gets passed down and hidden. I learned that my mother's behavior made sense in context. She didn't report her father because she was a child without language for what was happening. She was ashamed and internalized blame. She had no support system. Her own mother didn't protect her. My grandmother and my mother's mother failed to protect her daughter from her husband's abuse. That's another layer of trauma. Being a mother who knew or suspected abuse and didn't stop it, or perhaps didn't know, perhaps was also a victim in her own way. Trauma is complicated. It's not clean. It's not always a clear good versus evil. Sometimes victims protect their abusers. Sometimes they stay in situations that harm their children. It's not excusable, but it's understandable in the context of trauma. My mother broke that cycle. She didn't abuse me. She didn't harm me. She was hyperprotective in ways that were sometimes excessive, but she was trying to keep me safe. She raised me to be capable, kind, and aware of trauma and dysfunction. She did the best she could with the tools she had, and eventually she told the truth. Breaking cycles of abuse requires tremendous strength and awareness. My mother did that. She survived. She protected her child. She eventually sought healing and truth. I also had to understand my grandfather in a more nuanced way. Was he a monster? Yes, in terms of his actions. Absolutely. But was he perhaps also traumatized? Was he perhaps also a victim of something? I don't know. He's never talked about it. He's never sought help. But there's often a chain. Someone hurt becomes someone who hurts. Not always. Not everyone who's hurt goes on to hurt others. Many survivors become the most protective, the most careful, the most aware. But sometimes trauma creates more trauma. My grandfather hurt my mother. My mother hurt nobody, but she was hurt. That's generational trauma. That's how it works. But sometimes trauma creates more trauma. My grandfather hurt my mother. My mother hurt nobody, but she was hurt. That's generational trauma. That's how it works. Understanding this doesn't excuse him, but it helps me understand how this happened. It helps me see it as a problem bigger than one bad person. It's a family dysfunction, a generational wound, and I'm the generation that can choose to heal it. That's my responsibility now. Not my fault, but my responsibility. Do you think understanding generational trauma as the root cause helps forgive abusers, or does it just complicate things? It's been 3 years since my mother told me. I'm in therapy. I've been seeing a trauma-informed therapist who specializes in family dysfunction and intergenerational trauma. It's helped. It's given me tools to process and understand. My relationship with my mother has deepened. We've worked through a lot. I've come to understand her as both my mother and as a person who survived something I can barely comprehend. I love her more now than I did before, not despite what happened to her, but because of how she survived it. My relationship with my half-brother has also developed. We text regularly. We see each other a few times a year. There's something unique about our connection. We shared the same abuser's DNA. We shared the same starting point of trauma. But we're also building something new. A relationship defined by healing rather than abuse. My grandfather is in a care facility. He's very old now. He's declining. I don't know what I feel about him. Anger, certainly. Sadness also. Confusion. I don't plan to confront him. I don't think it would help. I think he's beyond accountability. But I also don't forgive him. I don't absolve him of what he did. I just exist in the reality of what happened. I think about the child I don't have. I think about whether I want to have biological children. Part of me fears passing down the trauma. Part of me fears my own capacity to cause harm. But my therapist reminds me, awareness is protection. Knowledge is power. The fact that I understand these patterns means I can interrupt them. I can choose differently. I don't have to repeat what happened to my mother. I don't have to perpetuate what my grandfather did. I can heal. I can choose health. My mother and I have also started talking about how to honor the truth while protecting her. Privacy and my grandfather's remaining. family members. We've decided to keep it private, not because we're ashamed, but because healing isn't always public. Some truths are for the family to process. Some stories are for us to tell when and how we choose. But I also know that by sharing this, by being open about it, we're breaking the silence that allowed abuse to happen. We're saying this happened. It was wrong, and we survived it. That matters. If you discovered something this traumatic in your family, would you tell people? Would you keep it private? What would you do? What I've learned from this experience is that family trauma is more common than we acknowledge. There are so many families keeping secrets like this. So many children who don't know their origins. So many survivors who never told their story. The silence around abuse is what allows it to continue. By speaking about it, even anonymously online, we break that silence. We say, this happens. It's real. And people survive it. I've also learned that understanding trauma doesn't fix it, but it does provide a framework for healing. I understand now why my mother was the way she was. That understanding doesn't erase the effects of her trauma, but it helps me relate to her differently. I understand that my existence, while rooted in violence, isn't defined by it. I am not my grandfather's crime. I am not my mother's trauma. I am my own person. But I'm also informed by these things. They're part of my story. I'm also aware that I'm privileged in some ways. My mother survived. She protected me. She raised me with love. Not all children of abuse are so fortunate. So I feel a responsibility to use my story to advocate for survivors, to support abuse prevention, to help others who are processing similar traumas. That's how I make meaning out of something that has no inherent meaning. That's how I break the cycle. I also want to say, if you're reading this and you've experienced sexual abuse, or you know someone who has, there's help. There are resources. There are people who understand. There are communities of survivors. You don't have to carry this alone. And if you're a parent trying to protect your child from trauma, or trying to process your own trauma while raising the next generation, you're not alone either. There are therapists. There are support groups. There are people who understand. Generational trauma can be interrupted. Cycles can be broken. Healing is possible. It's not easy. It takes time and work and support. But it's possible. What do you think makes the difference between someone repeating generational trauma and someone breaking the cycle? So that's the story. And what makes it so important is that it's about truth. For decades, this story was hidden. Multiple generations carrying secrets. Multiple people bearing the weight of trauma in silence. And when the truth finally came out, it was painful. Devastating even. But it was also liberating. Because secrets have power when they're hidden, but they lose power when they're named. This man discovered he's the product of his grandfather's sexual abuse of his mother. That's an enormous, horrible thing to process. I want to ask you, what secrets does your family carry? What traumas are unspoken? Drop a comment and tell me. Do you think this man should have been told sooner? Thanks for watching. If this story made you think about family, trauma, and the power of truth, please hit like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.